People often ask me how I first met Sherlock Holmes. In the year 1878, I became a surgeon in the army and joined a regiment stationed in India. In 1880, I was struck in the arm by a bullet in Afghanistan. Then, while recovering in hospital, I came down with a fever which left me so weak that the Army Medical Board decided to send me back to England. I ended up in London, where I took up residence in a hotel on the Strand. London is a vast, unfriendly place when you don't know anyone. It's also expensive, and I could barely make ends meet. One day I was sitting in a bar by myself, thinking I should probably find somewhere cheaper to live, when I felt a tap on the shoulder. To my delight, I saw it was Stamford, an old colleague from my days as a hospital doctor. "Where have you been, Dr. Watson?" he cried. "You're as thin as a rake." I told him briefly about my misadventures in the East. "Poor devil," he said. "What are you up to now?" "Looking for lodgings." "By Jove," he said. "You're the second person to say that to me today." "Who was the first?" I asked. "A fellow called Sherlock Holmes, who works in the chemical laboratory at the hospital. He was complaining this morning because he couldn't find anyone to go halves with him on some lovely rooms he'd found on Baker Street." "Well, if he's looking for a roommate, I'm the man for him," I said. "I'm fed up with living alone." "I warn you, he's a little strange," said Stamford. "Strange in what way?" "He's rather too scientific for my tastes, almost cold-blooded in his search for the truth." "Is he a medical student?" "No, I don't really know what he is. He's very knowledgeable on anatomy and a first-class chemist, but his studies are very eccentric." Something about this man intrigued me. "I should like to meet him," I said. So, after lunch, we drove over to the hospital, where we found Holmes in the chemical laboratory. At the sound of our steps, he glanced around and uttered a cry of pleasure. "I've found it!" he cried. "I've found the perfect test for identifying bloodstains." "Sherlock Holmes, meet Dr. John Watson," said Stamford. "Pleased to meet you," said Holmes, shaking my hand. "You've been in Afghanistan, I see." "How on earth did you know that?" I asked in astonishment. "Never mind," he said. "Come and observe this test." He seized me by the coat sleeve and dragged me to the table where he'd been working. "I need fresh blood," he said, pricking his finger with a long needle and drawing a drop of blood into a jar full of water and stirring it. He added some crystals and a drop of transparent fluid, and the water turned a dull brown. "You see," he said, "the presence of even the tiniest drop of blood can be revealed by this method." "And how is this useful?" I asked. "Why, it could determine a person's guilt or innocence of a crime," he declared. "A suspect might have brownish stains on his clothing. Are they blood, mud, or fruit juice? The Sherlock Holmes test will determine the truth." His eyes glittered as he spoke, and he gave a bow, as if to an applauding crowd. "Congratulations, Holmes," said Stamford. "But we're actually here on business. My friend here is, like you, looking for lodgings, so I thought I'd bring you two together." Holmes seemed delighted by the idea. "You don't mind me conducting chemical experiments in the flat?" he asked. "Or playing the violin?" "Not at all," I said. "I get down in the dumps sometimes. You mustn't think I'm sulky. Just leave me alone and I'll soon be all right." "That's fine," I said. "Well, that's settled then." He smiled. "Why don't you come and see the rooms tomorrow?" We met the next day at noon and inspected the flat at 221B Baker Street. It consisted of a couple of comfortable bedrooms and a large sitting room, cheerfully furnished. The landlady, Mrs. Hudson, seemed very friendly. We moved in that same evening and began unpacking and getting settled. Holmes was an interesting man to live with. When busy on some project, he worked on it non-stop with a frenzied kind of energy, barely stopping to sleep or eat. But when he had nothing going on, he'd lie around for days on end, barely uttering a word or moving a muscle. I discovered he had an extraordinary knowledge of certain subjects, such as poisons and the law, but was surprisingly ignorant about other things. "You mean you really didn't know that the Earth goes round the sun?" I cried. "What does it matter whether we go around the sun or the moon?" he declared impatiently. "It makes no difference to me or my work." I often wondered what that work was, but something about his manner stopped me from asking. He had many visitors, who he called his clients, and they seemed to come from all walks of life. There was a sallow-faced, bespectacled man called Lestrade, who called 3 or 4 times a week. Holmes was also visited by a fashionably dressed young woman, an elderly tradesman, and a railway porter in his uniform. Holmes would meet with his clients in our sitting room. I was filled with curiosity about what went on in these meetings, but I preferred to wait for Holmes to tell me about it himself. One morning, it was March the 4th, 1881, he finally did. We were eating breakfast, and I happened to be glancing at an article in a magazine. "What complete twaddle!" I said after a moment, flinging the magazine aside. "What's that?" asked Holmes. "This article claims you can work out the personality, habits, and job of a complete stranger simply through observation and deduction. It's utter nonsense." "Oh, yes, I wrote that one," said Holmes calmly. "You?" I cried. "Yes, and I assure you the methods I describe are entirely practical. In fact, I use them to do my job." "And what job is that?" "I'm a consulting detective, possibly the only one in the world. When police detectives and private detectives get stuck, they come to me. Lestrade, for example, that bespectacled chap who's often here, works for the London police." "Not all your visitors look like detectives," I remarked. "Some are ordinary citizens recommended to me by private investigators. They're all people with troubles of one sort or another. I listen to their stories, solve their problems, then pocket my fee." "And you do all this using observation and deduction? It sounds impossible." "Oh, you'd be surprised. When we first met, I used those methods to work out you'd been in Afghanistan." "But how?" "Well, Stamford introduced you as doctor, and you have a military way of walking, so most likely an army doctor. Your tan wasn't your natural skin tone because your wrists were pale, so you'd been somewhere hot. Your haggard face and the stiffness in your arm suggested you'd undergone hardship and injury. The most recent military action involving the British Army in a hot country was in Afghanistan, so that had to be where you'd been." "It's quite simple when you explain it," I said. Holmes sighed. "Everyone says that, yet no one seems able to do it but me." There was a knock at the door, and a messenger handed Holmes a letter. He opened it and read it to me. "Dear Mr. Holmes, there was a murder last night at 3 Lauriston Gardens off the Brixton Road. A policeman saw a light on at about 2 o'clock and went to investigate. He found the door open and, in the front room, the corpse of a man. Cards in his pocket identify him as Mr. Enoch Drebber of Cleveland, Ohio, USA. The house is empty and there's blood in the room, but no evidence of how the man met his death. The whole affair is a puzzler. Come any time before 12 and you'll find me here. I would be grateful for your opinion. Yours faithfully, Tobias Gregson. Gregson is one of the brightest detectives in the London police force, remarked Holmes. He and Lestrade are both quick and energetic, but they're too conventional in their thinking. They're jealous of each other, too. I'll have some fun in this case if they're both put on the scent. Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. Holmes put on his coat. "Come with me, Watson, if you've nothing better to do." Intrigued to see Holmes use his methods in action, I agreed, and a moment later we were in a hansom cab driving toward Brixton. Number 3 Lauriston Gardens was a terraced house with empty windows and a melancholy air. At the door, we were met by the tall, pale, fair-haired Tobias Gregson. "It's good of you to come, Holmes," he said. "I've left everything untouched." "Except that." Holmes pointed at the many muddy footsteps on the walkway. "A herd of buffaloes wouldn't have caused greater mess. I trust you checked the walkway for footprints before you allowed this?" "I was too busy inside," said Gregson. "I left that to Lestrade." "Lestrade's here, too." Holmes glanced at me, smiling. "Did either of you come here in a cab?" "No, sir." "Good. Then let us inspect the room." Gregson and I followed him into the house, both puzzled by his odd question about the cab. The dining room was large and entirely empty of furniture. A layer of dust lay over everything. Lying stretched upon the bare floorboards was the body of a man. He was quite dead. The man was in his mid-40s with black hair and a short beard and wore an expensive coat. His rigid face wore a look of horror. His fists were clenched and his arms thrown wide, as if his death struggle had been extremely unpleasant. Lestrade appeared at the door. "We found no clues, Mr. Holmes," he said. "None whatsoever," confirmed Gregson. "Are you sure there's no wound?" "Positive." "Positive?" cried both detectives. "Then this blood belongs to someone else. Presumably the murderer." Holmes pointed to a splash of blood on the floor. He began examining the body. "You can take him to the mortuary now," he finally declared. Gregson ordered a stretcher and 4 men. As they raised the body, something rolled across the floor. Lestrade picked it up. "It's a woman's wedding ring." "What did you find in his pockets?" asked Holmes. Gregson showed him a box containing some odds and ends, including a letter to Enoch Drebber and Joseph Stangerson, confirming their places on a steamship voyage from Liverpool to New York. "Have you made queries about these men, Gregson?" asked Holmes. "Yes, but we've learned nothing yet." "Wait, I found something," cried Lestrade. We joined him in a gloomy corner of the room. Lestrade was holding a match up to the wall. There, on a bare piece of plaster, a single word had been scrawled in blood. R-A-C-H-E. "This is an important discovery, which would have been overlooked but for my eagle eye," said Lestrade. "And what does it mean, now you've found it?" asked Gregson disdainfully. Mean? The writer was going to write the name Rachel, but was disturbed before they could finish. You mark my words, when this case is solved, you'll find there's a woman named Rachel involved. Holmes took out a tape measure and magnifying glass and began examining the room. For the next 20 minutes he moved about, studying virtually invisible marks and taking measurements. At one point, he carefully gathered a pile of dust from the floor and stored it in an envelope. Gregson and Lestrade looked on in bemusement. "What do you think, sir?" asked Gregson finally. "I wouldn't presume to offer you my help since you're both doing so well," answered Holmes. "But I'd like to speak to the policeman who found the body." "It was Constable John Rance," said Lestrade. He gave him the address. Before we left, Holmes turned to the detectives. "I'll tell you one thing that may help. The murderer was male, more than 6 feet tall, with small feet and long fingernails on his right hand. He wore square-toed boots and smoked an Indian cigar. He came here with his victim in a 4-wheeled cab drawn by a horse with 3 old shoes." Lestrade and Gregson stared at him, incredulous. "How was the murder done?" asked Lestrade. "Poison," said Sherlock Holmes. "One other thing, Lestrade. Rache is German for revenge, so don't waste time looking for a Miss Rachel." As we drove to the house of Constable Rance, Holmes told me how he'd made these impressive deductions. "I noticed the wheel ruts and hoof marks of the cab when we arrived. Last night was the first rain we've had for a week, so those impressions can only have come from that cab. The height of a man can be calculated from the length of his stride, and also from the height of the writing on the wall." "What about the long fingernails and the cigar?" I asked. "The writing on the wall was done by a man's forefinger dipped in blood. The plaster was scratched, which wouldn't have happened if his fingernails had been clipped. As for the cigar, I gathered some ash from the floor and recognized it as coming from a type of Indian cigar known as Trichi. I further deduced from a study of the footprints in the mud and dust that the 2 men arrived in the same cab and were best of friends at that stage, but Square-Toes gradually worked himself up into a fury." Constable Rance was in bed when we arrived at his house, and didn't look too pleased to be roused. "I've already reported what happened," he said grumpily as he showed us into his sitting room. "We'd like to hear it again," said Holmes. He offered him a half-sovereign, and Rance immediately became more obliging. "Of course. Well, at around 2 last night, I saw a light on in that house, which I knew to be empty because the last tenant in there died of typhoid fever due to the blocked drains. I suspected something was wrong and went to investigate, but when I got to the door—" "You stopped and walked back to the garden gate," Holmes interrupted. Rance jumped in surprise. "How did you know?" "To be honest, I got scared, thinking it was the previous tenant's ghost. But then I pulled myself together and went back in. I found a red wax candle flickering on the mantelpiece, and by its light I saw—" "We know what you saw. What happened then?" "I went back outside and blew my whistle to summon my colleagues." "Was the street empty when you came out?" "Yes, except for a drunk man who was at the gate singing his songs." "What sort of man was he?" Rance seemed puzzled that Holmes should be interested. "A tall fella, bearded, with a red face, wearing a brown overcoat. He was holding a cigar." As we drove back to our lodgings, Holmes muttered bitterly to himself. That blundering fool! To think he had the murderer in his hands and didn't realize. The drunkard, you mean? But why should the murderer return to the scene of his crime? For the ring, man. That's what he came back for. He must have dropped it while stooping over Drebber's body. After leaving, he realized he'd lost it and hurried back, but saw the police already there and pretended to be drunk. Now we can use the ring to catch him. Chapter 3. Gregson solves the case. Holmes placed an announcement in the evening newspapers. A plain gold wedding ring was found on Brixton Road this morning in the roadway outside the White Hart Tavern. Apply Dr. Watson, 221B Baker Street. Sorry for using your name, he said. Mine's too well known. That's fine, but I don't have a ring. Yes, you do, said Holmes, handing me one. It's almost identical to the one we found on the victim. And who do you expect will answer this advertisement? Why, the man in the brown coat, our cigar-smoking friend with the square toes. As Holmes spoke, the bell rang, and a clear voice asked, Does Dr. Watson live here? Surprise passed over Holmes's face at the sound of limping footsteps on the stairs and the feeble tap at the door. Instead of the tall man we expected, an old woman hobbled in. She drew out an evening paper and pointed at our advertisement. It's this that brought me, gentlemen, she said. The ring belongs to my daughter, Sally. Her husband won't be pleased to find her without it. Is this it? I asked, showing her the one Holmes had given me. The Lord be thanked, cried the woman. Yes, that's it. Sally will be a happy woman tonight. At a sign from Holmes, I handed her the ring. With many mumbled blessings and murmurs of gratitude, she pocketed it and shuffled off down the stairs. As soon as she was gone, Holmes grabbed his coat. She must be an accomplice. If I follow her, she'll lead me to him. I watched him dash away. It was almost midnight when he returned, and I saw from his face that he hadn't been successful. She hailed a passing cab and gave an address in Houndsditch, Holmes explained. Houndsditch is a long way from Brixton, so this was starting to look suspicious. I perched myself behind the cab, then hopped down when we were approaching the destination, following the rest of the way on foot. I watched the driver open the door, and no one came out. He searched the cab, cursing to find his passenger had disappeared. But how could that old woman get out of the cab while it was moving? I cried. Old woman? I think it was a young man in disguise. He saw he was being followed and managed to give me the slip. Clearly, old Squaretoes has a wily accomplice. The next day, the newspapers were full of the Brixton mystery, as they called it. There was plenty of speculation about who committed the crime, and some new information. The victim, an American named Enoch Drebber, had been living in London for some weeks with his private secretary, Joseph Stangerson, staying at the boarding house of Madame Charpentier in Camberwell. On March the 4th, they bid farewell to their landlady, saying they planned to go to Euston Station to catch a train to Liverpool and then a steamship back to America. They were later spotted together on the platform at Euston. Nothing more was seen of them until Drebber's body was found in an empty Brixton house, many miles from Euston. How he got there or met his fate was a mystery, as was the whereabouts of Stangerson. We were reading all this in the papers when I suddenly heard the pattering of many feet outside in the hall. "Ah, it's the Baker Street irregulars," said Holmes, and as he spoke, in rushed 6 of the dirtiest and most ragged street children I've ever seen. "Attention!" cried Holmes, and they all lined up in tight military formation. "Have you found it, Wiggins?" asked Holmes. "No, sir, we ain't," said the tallest of the youths. "Well, keep looking." He handed them each a shilling. "Now, off you go, and come back with a better report next time." He waved his hand, and they scampered away. "Is this about the Brixton case?" I asked. "Yes, there's something I need to find out. It's only a matter of time." The bell rang once again, and this time our visitor was Tobias Gregson, who seemed very pleased with himself. "Congratulate me, Holmes," he beamed as he came in. "I've solved the case." Holmes suddenly looked anxious. "You have?" "Yes, and that fool Lestrade will be so jealous. He's gone after Stangerson, who has nothing to do with any of it, while I've got the murderer locked up in a police cell." "And his name is?" "Arthur Charpentier," beamed Gregson. Holmes breathed a sigh of relief. "And how did you discover it was him?" "I visited the boarding house where Drebber was staying and spoke to the landlady, Madame Charpentier. At first, she stuck by her story that she bade farewell to Drebber and Stangerson on the morning of the 4th, but then her 20-year-old daughter Alice spoke up. "Let's be honest, Mother," she said. "We did see Mr. Drebber one more time after that." And that was when the truth came out. Drebber, it seems, was a coarse and brutish fellow. The reason he and his secretary left the house that morning was because Madame Charpentier had thrown them out after Drebber kissed and embraced Alice against her will. Later that day, Drebber returned, clearly drunk, and urged Alice to elope with him. She tried to get away, but he caught her wrist and began dragging her out. She screamed, and then her brother Arthur arrived. There was a scuffle, and Drebber bolted from the house. Arthur said, "I don't think that fellow will trouble us again." Then he started off after him down the street, swinging a heavy walking stick and saying, "I'll just go and see what he does with himself." "Oh, this is all quite exciting," said Holmes, stifling a yawn. "What happened next?" "I asked Mrs. Charpentier the all-important question. What time did her son return? She said he may have been gone 4 or 5 hours, easily enough time to commit the murder and return home. He's obviously guilty, so I went and found him at his place of work and arrested him." "What's your theory, then?" asked Holmes. "Charpentier must have followed Drebber to Brixton, where a fresh argument erupted between them, during which Charpentier struck Drebber with his stick, perhaps in the stomach, killing him without leaving a mark. He then dragged the body into the empty house. The candle, blood, and writing on the wall were all tricks to throw us off the scent." "And what did the young man say when you arrested him?" asked Holmes. "He denied it, of course. Claimed he followed Drebber for a while, but then the American gave him the slip. What amuses me is to think of Lestrade, who went off so eagerly on the wrong scent. Why, here's the man himself." It was indeed Lestrade who now entered the room. His face was troubled, his clothing untidy. "This is a most confusing case," he declared miserably. "Oh, you think so?" said Gregson, smiling triumphantly. "Did you manage to find the secretary?" "The secretary, Mr. Joseph Stangerson," said Lestrade, "was murdered at Halliday's Hotel at about 6 o'clock this morning." We stared dumbfounded at Lestrade. Gregson sprang up from his chair in shock, upsetting his drink. Sherlock Holmes looked grave. "Stangerson, too," he muttered. "The plot thickens." Chapter 4. The Mysterious Pills. Are you sure about this?" stammered Gregson. "It was I who discovered the body," said Lestrade. "I suspected Stangerson was involved in the death of Drebber and wanted to know where he was between 8:30, when he was spotted at Euston Station, and the time of the crime. I was searching hotels around Euston when I discovered he'd checked into Halliday's. They said he'd been waiting for a gentleman in his room for 2 days. We broke down the door to find him dead with a deep stab wound in his chest. Above his body, the word Rache had been written in blood," said Holmes. "Exactly," said Lestrade in an awestruck voice. "A passing milk boy said he saw a man escaping from Stangerson's second-floor room on a ladder. He described him as tall, with a reddish face, and dressed in a long brown coat." "Did you find any clues in the room?" asked Holmes. "Nothing of importance," said Lestrade. "A novel he'd been reading, a glass of water on the table, and a small box containing a couple of pills." Holmes sprang up from his chair with an exclamation of delight. "The last link!" he cried excitedly. "My case is complete." The two detectives stared at him in confusion. "Could you lay your hands on these pills?" asked Holmes. "I have them right here," said Lestrade, producing a small white box. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, would you mind going down and fetching Mrs. Hudson's poor sickly terrier? I remember her asking you to put it out of its misery yesterday." I went downstairs and returned with the dog in my arms. From the sound of its breathing and its glazed eyes, it was clearly close to death. Holmes dissolved one of the pills in some water and milk. The dog lapped it up and then lay down, showing no ill effect. This puzzled Holmes. He frowned, thinking for a moment, and then clicked his fingers. "I have it!" He took the other pill and dissolved it in more water and milk. This time, when the poor creature tasted the mixture, it gave a convulsive shiver and died. At first I was shocked, but the animal had been in pain, and its death was a mercy. Holmes nodded gravely. "Now I understand. Of the 2 pills in the box, one was deadly poison, while the other was harmless. I should have known that all along." All this mystery had become too much for Gregson. "Look here, Mr. Holmes. We deserve some answers. It seems I was wrong about Charpentier, and Lestrade was wrong to suspect Stangerson. So tell us, who killed Enoch Drebber?" "I could name the murderer," said Holmes, "but catching him is more important, and I hope to do that shortly, though it will require delicate handling. If he has the slightest suspicion we're after him, he'll disappear." As Holmes spoke, there came a tap at the door, and Wiggins, leader of the Baker Street Irregulars, entered. "Please, sir," he said, "I have the cab downstairs." "Good lad," said Holmes, taking a pair of handcuffs from a drawer. "Ask the cabman to come up and help me with my luggage, would you?" I was surprised to see Holmes pull out a large suitcase. He hadn't told me he was going on a journey. The cabman entered. "Ah, can you give me a hand with this buckle, cabman?" The fellow stepped forward. As he laid his hands on the suitcase, there was a sharp click, and the handcuffs closed on his wrists. "Gentlemen," cried Holmes, "may I introduce you to Mr. Jefferson Hope, murderer of Enoch Drebber and Joseph Stangerson." From his ruddy face to his square-toed shoes, Jefferson Hope looked a determined and formidable man, yet he seemed to accept his arrest calmly. "You should be chief of police," he said to Holmes in admiration. "The way you kept on my trail was remarkable." We escorted him back downstairs to his cab, where we put him aboard, and Lestrade drove us to the police station. On arrival, an official took down his details. "The prisoner will go before the magistrates later this week," he said. "In the meantime, Mr. Jefferson Hope, have you anything you wish to say? I warn you that your words will be taken down and may be used in evidence." "I've plenty to say," said Hope. "Best save it for your trial," said Gregson. "I may never be tried," he answered, before turning to me. "You're a doctor, aren't you? Put your hand here." I placed my hand as directed to his chest, and felt an abnormal throbbing and quivering. "You have a swollen blood vessel," I said. "You could die very soon." He nodded. "I know, and don't mind. I've done my work now, and don't care when I go. But I'd like to be remembered as something more than just a common cutthroat." Chapter 5. Jefferson Hope's Tale. So Jefferson Hope told us his story, and what a story it was. As a young man, he'd been a silver prospector, trapper, and explorer in the western United States. One day, while out hunting, he rescued a young woman from a cattle stampede. Her name was Lucy, and she introduced him to her father, John Ferrier. The Ferriers lived in a strict religious community. They owed their lives to the community because they had taken them in when they were starving. But since then, the Ferriers had grown to hate living in this community because they ruled with fear, and whoever spoke out against them was killed or imprisoned. Jefferson and Lucy fell in love, and John, who liked and respected Jefferson, happily agreed to the match. Soon after they were engaged, Jefferson left on a hunting trip. While he was away, the leader of the religious order visited the Ferriers. He decreed that Lucy must marry either Joseph Stangerson or Enoch Drebber. Both were senior members of the community, and they already had many wives, as this was the tradition with the order. Ferrier knew he couldn't disobey the leader and live, but he was also determined not to give his precious Lucy away to either of these men. He wrote to Jefferson, asking him to come back and help him and Lucy run away and start a new life. When Jefferson returned, the three of them stole away in the middle of the night. They made it to some woods where they set up camp. Then Jefferson left to hunt down some food. He returned to find Lucy and John gone. Frantically, he searched the area and came across a grave marked John Ferrier. He later learned that Stangerson and Drebber had followed them to the woods and killed Ferrier, kidnapped Lucy, and forced her to marry Drebber. She died shortly afterward of a broken heart. In his fury, Jefferson Hope dedicated the rest of his life to hunting down and killing Drebber and Stangerson. "I took the marriage ring from Lucy's dead finger," said Hope, "and vowed to show it to Drebber when I caught him, so he would be reminded of his crime before he died. My search took me 20 years and stretched across 2 continents, but I finally traced them to London, where I took a job as a cabman. It was some while before I found the boarding house where they were staying. I followed them all over town, hoping to catch either one of them alone, yet they were always together. 3 days ago, I spotted them outside their boarding house, loading their luggage into a cab and driving away. I followed them to Euston Station, where I got out of my cab and continued after them to the platform. They were waiting to catch their train to Liverpool, which was some hours delayed. I overheard Drebber tell Stangerson he had some personal business to attend to, but would be back before the train departed. If not, he'd meet him at Halliday's hotel. At last, my enemies had separated and were unable to protect each other. I followed Drebber back to his boarding house and waited there. A while later, the door swung open, and out came a young man holding Drebber by the collar. He shoved him into the street, yelling curses at him. Drebber got up and ran to the corner where, seeing my cab, he hailed me and jumped in, panting, "Take me to Halliday's hotel." Drebber was now in my power, and I knew exactly what I wanted to do with him. During my long life, I once worked as a janitor in a college laboratory where I happened to learn about a poison taken from the skin of a South American frog that could cause instant death. I stole a bottle of this substance and made some pills out of it. I put each pill into a box, along with a similar pill made without poison. My plan was to force each of these men to eat a pill from one of the boxes, while I ate the pill that remained. If there was any justice on this earth, they would pick the poisonous one. After we drove a short distance, Drebber ordered me to stop at a bar and wait for him while he had a few drinks. When he emerged a few hours later, very much worse for drink, I had a plan for where to take him. A few days before, a gentleman looking over some empty houses in the Brixton Road dropped the key to one of them in my cab. We pulled up at this house, and I woke Drebber, who had fallen into a drunken slumber. "It's time to get out," I said. "All right, cabby," he said, believing we'd arrived at the hotel. I had to help him along the garden path, the hallway, and into the front room. "It's awfully dark," he said. "Then let's have some light," I replied, lighting a wax candle and holding it to my face. "Now, Enoch Drebber," I said, "do you recognize me?" I saw the horror slowly dawning in his eyes. He staggered back as sweat broke out on his brow. "I've hunted you from the Sierra Nevada to the Ural Mountains," I growled. "Now your wanderings are over, my friend." As I spoke, my temples throbbed and blood suddenly gushed from my nose, terrifying him even more. "Will you murder me?" he asked. "This isn't murder, but justice," I cried, "for dragging my Lucy from her slaughtered father and forcing her to marry you." "I didn't kill John Ferrier," he said, "but you broke his daughter's innocent heart." I thrust the pillbox before him. "Let God judge between us. There's death in one and life in the other. Choose, and I'll take what you leave." He begged for mercy, but I threatened him with my knife until he obeyed me, then swallowed the other pill. We stood facing each other, waiting to see who would die. Suddenly, he uttered a terrible scream. The poison acted fast. I held Lucy's ring before his eyes as he collapsed to the floor and died. On impulse, I dipped a finger into the blood streaming from my nose and wrote the word Racha on the wall so people might have some hint of my reasons. With Drebber dead, I turned my attention to Stangerson. The desk clerk at his hotel gave me the room number, then I found a window cleaner's ladder and used it to climb in. I told him about his friend's death and gave him the same choice of pills. Instead of accepting my challenge, he attacked me. To defend myself, I stabbed him in the heart. For several minutes after Hope had finished his story, we sat in silence, taking it all in. Then Holmes asked Hope who his accomplice had been who came for the ring. Hope replied, "I'm sorry, Mr. Holmes. I don't mind confessing my own secrets, but I don't want to get others into trouble. I saw your advert and thought it might be a trick. My friend volunteered to go. I think you'll agree he acted smartly." "He certainly did," smiled Holmes. After that, the prisoner was led away by the warden. Chapter 6. How he knew. Later, back in Baker Street, Holmes told me how he had worked out the identity of the murderer. "I telegraphed the head of police in Cleveland, Ohio, and he told me that Drebber had asked for police protection against an old love rival named Jefferson Hope. This same Hope, he said, was currently in Europe. It was clear to me that if Hope was the murderer, then he had to be a cabman. The marks in the road outside the Brixton house showed that the cabman's horse had wandered on in a way that would have been impossible if anyone had been in charge of it. So the cabman must have gone into the house with the victim. I therefore sent out my Baker Street irregulars, and they quickly found Mr. Hope working for the cab company and summoned him here. We had been warned to appear before the magistrates the following Thursday to give evidence, but when Thursday came, there was no need of our presence. The morning after he gave his account to us, Jefferson Hope was found dead in his cell, with a peaceful smile on his face. "Gregson and Lestrade will be annoyed," Holmes remarked as we chatted about it later that evening. "Putting him behind bars would have been a career highlight for them." "I don't see that they had very much to do with his capture," I said. "What you do in this world matters little," sighed my friend. "The key is what you can make people believe you've done. As for me, I wouldn't have missed this case for anything. It's been fun, hasn't it, Watson?" "Indeed it has," I replied. "I think I've developed a taste for this kind of adventure."